Hello, I'm the Reverend Ben Randall, Senior Associate Rector here at Galilee Episcopal Church in Virginia Beach. And this is session 4 of our Lenten 2024 teaching series, which we're calling The Tales of Triumph. In previous sessions, we've been introduced to a number of inspiring heroes of the faith, including Constantine, the first Christian Caesar. And speedy and sweeping changes followed his conversion, one of which was the transferal of the imperial capital eastwards to the ancient Greek-speaking city of Byzantium, thereafter called Constantinople. It was a momentous decision. Situated on a roughly triangular peninsula at the north end of the Sea of Marmara, shaped like the snout of a young rhinoceros, I like to think, it was called the crossroads of the universe. With water on three sides, Constantinople was an ideal defensive location. One needed to only build a wall on the west, and the place became basically impregnable. Indeed, it is almost as if Constantine foresaw how the Roman Empire in Europe was about to be submerged beneath the tidal wave of barbarism, massive migrations of nomads collapsing into the continent, churning the population up, causing centuries of strife, and permanently rewriting the map. During that chaotic Dark Age, as it's known, Constantinople was a sanctuary. It was a strongly fortified bubble of stability and prosperity. It grew and grew, becoming more and more fabulous. And that buoyancy meant that the aforementioned walls, which protected the citizenry, were by them repeatedly attended to with grateful pride. They were made taller, thicker. They became, in fact, the largest urban defense work of late antiquity, 4 miles in length, 12 meters high, and dotted with towers topped with catapults and cauldrons of oil. There was a moat even. I took my family to see the walls, and they are still very impressive even today. Despite having stood for over a millennium and a half, despite 23 sieges, despite repeated cannon bombardments, neglect, and some purposeful demolishment here and there. When I saw them, they had stray cats, wild dogs, and homeless Syrians living amongst their ruins. These walls proved to be the ace up the sleeve of the Romans. Additionally, of course, she always had her legions, and in almost every generation there seemed to be a general of exceptional ability to lead those men. A Scipio Africanus, a Lucius Cornelius Sulla, Gaius Julius Caesar, Nero Claudius Drusus, Trajan, Belisarius. The Romans had secret superweapons too. They always appeared to be ahead of the curve on the battlefield. The Scorpion, for instance, was a tripod-mounted device that could launch iron bolts with such extreme velocity that they would punch right through the thickest armor. It was like a sniper rifle before there were even bullets. And more terrifying, almost demonic, the Romans had liquid fire. We still don't know how they did it. It was conjured up sometime around 675 AD. The mysterious ingredients were pressurized inside of a boiler tank and then ejected onto the enemy from a bronze hose as a flaming gelid mass, a nearly unquenchable toxic spume. But when Italy was lost to the Ostrogoths, the heartland of the empire, its most populous, fertile, productive province became what is today called the country of Turkey. And it seemed like the Romans would go on reinventing themselves again and again until Jesus returned. But that event, Jesus' return, the end of the world, seemed imminent at the end of the 11th century. Yes, in 1094, the basileus of the Romans, that is, the emperor, was Alexios Komnenos. And when he looked across the Bosphorus Strait to the far bank, at Asia, he saw a sight to chill the blood. The Turks had arrived. He had been fighting them his whole life, but they were like a human avalanche, a mobile nation. They had no use for towns or vineyards or arable land. They preferred a desert in which they could wander at large with their flocks and herds, and there were thousands and thousands of them. Surely this was Gog and Magog finally come to destroy the new Israel. One eyewitness said that the Turks were innumerable, surpassing in numbers even a great swarm of bees. Truly, from Constantinople, looking out, the Turkish horde really did seem like the prophet Joel's prediction of Judgment Day. They did look, and I quote, like blackness spread upon the mountains. Before them peoples were in anguish, said the prophet. All faces would grow pale. Like warriors they charge, they scale the wall, they climb up into the houses, they enter through the windows like a thief. The earth quakes before them, the heavens tremble. I'm quoting here from chapter 2. How had the Turks got so close to the capital? Not all at once. They had made for themselves an entrance into the empire a few years earlier, in August 1071, at the Battle of Manzikert, which was an unmitigated, humiliating military catastrophe for the Romans. It profoundly and forever shifted the balance of power between Christians and Muslims in the East. The reason for the Turks' success was multifaceted, as you probably can imagine, but we can single out a few factors. One was that the Turks were zealous jihadists, fully committed to spreading the Dar al-Islam, which was proving to be for them extremely profitable, the raiding and the plundering and so on. Secondly, the way the Turks fought, like the Parthians and the Scythians before them, with a short compound bow from the back of a stout pony, was very tricky to counter. Devastating, in fact. The Romans were often forced to charge through a hail of Turkish arrows to engage them at close quarters. This tactic meant, in other words, that the Turks were incapable of striking their enemy whilst themselves staying out of range. Thirdly, the direction of their migration. The Turks came from the north, from the Himalaya steppe through Azerbaijan. The Romans, however, usually called the Byzantines in this period, had been fighting the Arabs in the south for about 400 years, ever since their so-called prophet Muhammad had instigated his followers to conquer the world for Allah, and in particular to conquer Constantinople, which was especially coveted. It became an almost sort of Shangri-La in the Arabic imagination. The Turks called it the Red Apple. It taunted their ambitions and cramped their dreams of conquest. And unwittingly, by a stroke of luck then, the Turks had sidestepped the Romans' established fortified zone in Syria, and they came in behind it, that is, they came in above it. And so many of the cities they overran didn't even have walls. They hadn't needed them. The Pax Romana was remarkable. Hence the population, now unexpectedly exposed to attack, they suffered terribly. There was extensive massacre in many places. Whole towns were wiped out, all the men killed, all the women and the girls sold as slaves, many for sex work. Considerable damage was done to churches. The secular infrastructure, aqueducts, roads and so forth, they were vandalized and degraded. One survivor put it like this. He said, I quote, "The infidels entered the city with sharp swords, 3 swords each, in fact, 1 in each hand and 1 held in the teeth. And they killed the believers, that is the Christians, heaping their bodies in the street like horrifying heaps of stones." The empire then, Alexios' empire, was reeling. All of the Orient seemed arrayed against him. So he decided to do something radical. His first thought was to talk to the Turks, to see if he couldn't co-opt some of the many warlords and maybe even make them his allies. But it was like negotiating with a murderously masochistic hydra, willing to tear off its own heads whenever one of them agreed to make peace, usually induced to do so by a large chest of gold and silver. Anna, Alexios' adult daughter, kept a detailed diary of all the shenanigans. In 1090, for instance, she tells us that Abu al-Qasim was invited to wine and dine at the palace in Constantinople. He was offered a stipend and gifts. He was offered a lavish amusement program comprising sightseeing, horse races in the hippodrome, hunting and visits to the public baths, where there was warm, running water scented with oils. He was made a duke, a dux in Latin. And what do they say? Flattery will get you everywhere. Abu al-Qasim was seduced by the good life to which he was briefly admitted, and suddenly, you might say inevitably, life in a drafty yurt drinking sour goat milk wasn't quite so sexy as it had been. Yes, he returned to the far shore, to Asia, as a loyal Roman and assisted Alexios' soldiers to capture a castle on the northern shore of the Lake of Nicaea for the emperor. And a toehold was great. better than nothing. But then an assassin snuck into Abu Qasim's tent and strangled him to death. So Alexios tried again. In 1092, he reached out to another Turkish warlord, a more important one called Malik Shah. He too was warm to the idea of a truce, so somebody had him poisoned. Turkey had utterly disintegrated. The region was constantly embroiled in war, and what we find in the historical sources is a common thread running through them, that the Turkish presence was wasting the countryside and depopulating the regions they settled. And most ominously, the Turks had begun to experiment with building boats large enough and numerous enough to ferry their warriors across to the Balkan side of the strait, that is, to Europe, and this wouldn't do. So Alexios decided something else radical. One expert describes it as a desperate roll of the dice. He wrote a letter to the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, a man he considered a heretic, summoning him to send help for what very well might be the last battle, Armageddon. Yes, if this was the apocalypse, Alexios intended to go down swinging, and there was no one better to have his back than the brutish northerners squatting in what he still considered the other half of his empire, the one beside the Atlantic. He had employed these rednecks before they became a common sight in the Roman armies during the 11th century. Franks, Saxons, Vikings, Normans. But he needed these auxiliaries now in unprecedented numbers. He also didn't have any money to pay them. He was broke. The streets of Constantinople were teeming with refugees from Asia Minor. The Westerners, therefore, would have to come for reasons of their own choosing. Non-material reasons. Ideological reasons. Consequently, he made his plea to them as brothers in Christ. The letter, conveyed by a team of silver-tongued diplomats, arrived during a church synod, a council, meeting in the town of Piacenza in March 1095, and the Pope, Urban II, was very pleased to receive it. Alexios' plea presented him with a singular, once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. The Church had been attempting, failing, to domesticize the rampant warrior culture that pervaded Western Europe, which the emerging Christian nations had inherited from their Germanic pagan forebears. That older culture, the Germanic pagan one, lurked below a thin sanctified veneer, and its golden rule wasn't in fact the golden rule, it was an eye for an eye, and this ethos was causing chaos. If only someone could find a way to channel it outward. Alexios' request then might act as a kind of safety valve for the knightly class. Urban was also deeply concerned for the situation in the Holy Land. Indeed, everybody was. Pilgrimage was an exceedingly popular thing to do in the early Middle Ages, but the occupation of Judea by various Islamic polities had made venturing to the places of Jesus' birth, his crucifixion and resurrection, highly dangerous and prohibitively expensive for all but the nobility, because of all the bribes that had to be paid to every petty sheikh and sultan along the route. Indeed, an enormous high-profile expedition in 1065, led by the Archbishop of Mentz, was slaughtered, despite having mercenary protection. Barely a quarter made it home alive. Furthermore, the Fatimid Caliph, based in Egypt, Al-Ahim, had torched the Holy Sepulchre in a fit of spite in 1009 and levelled many other churches in the area, as many as 30,000, we think. And these churches still lay in ruins. A number of popes had already previously called for something to be done, for an intervention. Popes like Pope Sergius IV, for example, Pope Gregory VII. Some popes were even themselves refugees from the area in question, 2 at least. In other words, what Urban noticed was that Alexios' appeal for assistance afforded him a way to advance a self-serving papal agenda. We might decry this fact, but we shouldn't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. After all, Jesus himself taught that we are to be wise as serpents and innocent as doves. For, as he himself acknowledged, we are in this life like sheep in the midst of wolves. I'm quoting there from Matthew 10:16. For this reason, the Church has long taught that there might be exceptional circumstances in which Christians, the saints, are called to take up arms, not for their own safety, but because the love we're commanded to show our neighbours sometimes demands that we step in to protect those neighbours from a persistent aggressor. And what should be clear to you, I hope, is that the Turks and the holy war they were waging against the Romans, that qualified for a robust response. Thus, on the 27th of November, 1095, in a meadow outside the town of Clermont in central France, Pope Urban II stood up to deliver one of the most electrifying sermons in history, an emotional appeal aimed at the guts rather than at the head. He drew a lurid, colourful picture of the situation in the East. It was now or never. So acute was the crisis over there that Urban promised that all those who went to help Alexios would have their sins forgiven. It was an absurd, impossible promise, but the crowds eagerly responded. His sermon spread like the plague, that is to say, it went viral. Men and women of all classes signed up. In Cornwall, for example, in England, 43 packed up and went, most of them poor, among them a tailor, a smith, and a shoemaker. All pilgrims, as they were called, were told to sew a red cross cloth onto their clothing, and they were ordered to gather at Constantinople, where they were there to make themselves available to the emperor for whatever should happen next. And, sure enough, when the main fighting force marched out from Constantinople against the Turks in the spring of 1097, it was an army under Roman imperial command. And a Roman fleet sailed along the coast to keep the army supplied as it marched and fought. There was simply no way it could survive by foraging. In addition, these pilgrims received local support from the native Christian population at almost every step, who viewed these foreigners as their liberators. Indeed, one scholar, having analysed the data as to the composition of this army, concludes that the Armenian role, for instance, seems almost to be that of an equal partner. Even with these indigenous allies, however, the pilgrim army was David in a contest against Goliath. The sources consistently make it clear that they were heavily outnumbered by their Muslim opponents. Yet nonetheless, the pilgrims not only restored control of numerous Christian majority cities to the rule of Alexios, they made it all the way to Jerusalem herself, capturing it in July 1099. At Bethlehem, the whole city came out in procession, with all the relics and the crosses from the Church of the Nativity to welcome their rescuers and to kiss their hands. Thus, to be clear, what became known as the First Crusade was not colonialism. A seeming colonialist reality unavoidably emerged, to be sure. That is to say, some of the leaders of the First Crusade, such as Godfrey of Bouillon and Baldwin of Bologna, established homes for themselves in the Holy Land, Crusader states. But honestly, these states were absolutely necessary to preclude an immediate reversal of their hard-won victories against the Turkish principalities that they repulsed from the region. Had all the Crusaders simply returned directly home, having restored unrestricted pilgrim access to Jerusalem and so on, the culprits who had complicated Christian residence in the area in the first place would simply have rushed back to refill the power vacuum and resumed their intolerant, persecutory policies. Furthermore, nearly every pilgrim did return home. Just a minuscule number chose to remain. Of the 10 bishops who we know left for the East on the First Crusade, for example, only one remained in Judea to make his home there, though he did so as a cave-dwelling hermit. So why tell this tale? Why does any of this matter? Well, I really do believe that we can find something positive in the example of those volunteers who risked so much, enduring what was a pretty horrible experience: hunger, disease, brutal fighting, and why? For the sake of the other. This is undeniably not an uncontroversial thing to say, given the bloodshed inherent to crusading. But Just as we look back with justified approval on our forebears who opposed the Nazis and the Soviets, so we too might consider that the Crusades, before they were diverted and perverted, that they really were, if not an unalloyed, example of rather remarkable discipleship. Did you know that many pilgrims bankrupted themselves utterly to participate? The cost of crusading was crippling, it was ruinous. Yet men like Godfrey sold everything that they had to take part, so that the price of property in the West plummeted, and coin, hard currency, became scarce across the entire continent, because so much was being carried away in purses to pay for transit and lodging to get to the front, to where the fighting was, to defend God's church in some very arid places. Which brings me to my second and last point. Far too often, the Crusades are invoked to shame Christians, including by Christians themselves. The Crusades are held over our heads like the sword of Damocles, weaponized by skeptics and atheists to discredit us and our gospel. And we should say no more. That is to say, my challenge is for each of us to refuse to perpetuate the caricature of the crusade, the myth that has been allowed to usurp the truth. And that caricature is doing real harm to the reputation of Jesus' followers, and it needn't. Was there a lot of violence? Yes. But was that violence regrettably necessary? Also yes. But its character was not peculiar for that period, but rather, to quote a specialist, within the bounds of contemporary practice in West and East. God bless you.